Today, Joanna Bernard, the Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, New Brunswick, joins us to speak about the tax agreement between the First Nations and the Higgs government. Here's what she has to say.
I want to just explain a little bit about what happened back in, I believe we met with the Prime Minister on November 29th. We had not a lot of time to speak with him, but it was 2-minute. And I focused on the relationship with the province of New Brunswick and the 15 First Nations within New Brunswick because of the Truth and Reconciliation. This is a federal endeavor that's going on here with trying to get all across Canada the truth first and then reconciliation after. But in order to do that, we need here in New Brunswick to have a relationship. And I don't think Higgs wants to have a relationship with the 15 First Nations in New Brunswick. It's he's been doing everything since he's been in to make it more difficult for us. I mean, moving forward with our economic development and any other issue that we're doing and within the province, I don't think Higgs feels that he has any responsibility. But with the Truth and Reconciliation being a federal issue, this should trickle down to the First Nation, to the provinces, to help this along. And he doesn't seem to have that field to move forward with us, or I don't know what the word would be, but he just doesn't want. I mean, last time I read an article that he says, oh no, we can't have rich First Nations, like wealthy First Nations, I think was the word he used. We can't have wealthy First Nations in New Brunswick, which means to me, like, what is he talking about? Why would he say that? There are rich regions or wealthy regions all across Canada, and why can't New Brunswick have some wealthy First Nations? If we work hard, we deserve it. And we're not asking for a handout from the province. We're doing it on our own with these tax agreements that came out in 1995. And we've been working on them since they were signed off. That actually not all First Nations have, but most of them have now at this point in time. They have pulled them off the shelf and started working, and because you can't get water from a stone. We all know that there's lack of funding all across all the different departments, whether it's education or health or social. There's just not enough money. And the only way that we here in New Brunswick could get through that, because like, as I mentioned, you're not going to get water from a stone. They just don't have the funding. And it's not only for Indigenous people, non-Indigenous departments, as like whether it's health or not, or education. They also need extra funding, but fortunately we have our tax agreement, and the only way that we can get above that is to make our own in-house resources, and that's what we did. And now we're so successful that Higgs doesn't like it. He just doesn't think that First Nations should have that flexibility to govern themselves as it is already written in our treaties and the Indian Act.
So can you tell us about the tax agreement and why it is so important for the First Nations, and how does it affect Indigenous entrepreneurship?
Well, from experience, I was chief for 10 years from 2003 to 2013. And the experience that I've had with the tax agreements was phenomenal. We did everything. We followed the rules. Like, there were rules that were in the province where you couldn't sell Indian, they called them Indian cigarettes and gaming and everything. And our First Nation followed the rules to the T. We did everything we were supposed to do so we wouldn't jeopardize our tax agreements, but yet they're still being pulled out from underneath us. And we've had a high level of entrepreneurs and the First Nation themselves here take this serious, and we're doing so well. And finally we're able to have our own make our own decisions on where this money will go, whether it's to subsidize our health department, whether it's to subsidize our education, or social, we now have that flexibility, because with government funding, you have to spend it where they give it to you, and there's never enough. So with this surplus, it allows us to decide where we're going to add that money to whatever shortfall we have in our budgets. And that's for all First Nations, right? But now that he wants to decide whether we can use that money or not, he wants to do, I think what he wants is to say, okay, well, I'm going to keep the money and you put in an application for economic development. And if I feel that you need it, then I'll give it to you.
Mhm.
Where's that? How's that going to work? If a First Nation doesn't need more economic development, then they don't get it. If First Nation needs, see, I think that he's taking the money and he's going to make it look like the province is giving all of this to us, when in reality, it's our own money that we've collected, and we've had an agreement. He's supposed to resubmit a portion of that back to us so we can make our own decisions, but he doesn't want to do that. And I really feel bad, because when the First Nations get to a point of no return in moving forward and maybe doing their own tax regime, doing their own gaming and doing all this other stuff, it's going to be too late for the province.
Mhm.
So I just worry about that. And because we have a great relationship with the citizens of New Brunswick. They're really, I think, proud of our First Nations that they have here. When you look across Canada, there's some really serious issues. And I think people are proud to have their First Nations in New Brunswick doing so well.
So the tax agreement is ending or expiring this month. Can you tell us about the pending cancellation of the revenue sharing agreement? What's the situation right now?
The situation right now is our tax agreements will be finishing up December 31st, 2022. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the First Nations, there's some that are finishing up now, some are finishing up 2023, December 31st, 2023. And I believe some of the First Nations have asked for an extension so that it all finishes up at the same time. And it also gives us time to work on something else with the province. Whether that's going to happen or not with these so-called let me decide how you're going to live kind of thing, just doesn't, I don't think it's going to fly with any of the First Nations. It's working well. I don't know why he wants to remove these tax agreements, because from the very beginning, the tax agreements were put in place so that there would be a fair playing field for business. What was happening was the non-Indigenous businesses were complaining that the Indigenous businesses were not charging taxes. So this is how these tax agreements came about. So the government at the time said, okay, well, we'll make it an even playing field. We will get them to charge taxes. So it'll be the same for Indigenous businesses as well as non-Indigenous business. And it worked out fine. And it's been working fine since. But now he wants to pull that away and then make the playing field uneven again, because I feel the potential for First Nations to maybe collect a tax, maybe a First Nations tax, and not submit a penny to the province. And maybe that tax may be less. So who's going to, this to the demise of the province? I don't think Higgs is seeing the big picture. I think he's just like seeing what's in front of him right now and thinking that all that money can't go to First Nations. It's just not right. We want to tell them how to live. I don't know. I'm just worried, because the purpose of the taxes agreement, they weren't just given to us out of the kindness of their hearts. There was a reason for those tax agreements in the first place. And that is what I don't think he sees. And then, like I said, it's going to be not going to be very good for the businesses, non-native businesses, if the First Nations run their businesses without collecting tax. There's going to be another fight with the government, with the non-native businesses and the government, because this is the purpose of the tax agreement in the first place. And I'm not sure even if Higgs is aware of that.
So how can the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau or the federal government intervene in this dispute between the Higgs government and the First Nations?
Well, when I did speak to the Prime Minister, I kind of asked him for his help, being that we do have the Truth and Reconciliation. We have 92 calls to action, and some of them are are what we're talking about right now. And so if that's the case, then why shouldn't the federal government be working with the provincial governments to make that happen? And he kind of told me that he can't do much because it's a provincial thing, but at the end of the day, we still do have the Truth and Reconciliation, and that's where I want the federal government to step in and to find ways to get Higgs to see the light at the end of the tunnel here, because it's not going to be good for the province if something doesn't happen. It's just going to get worse here. And I just worry about Higgs not seeing the big picture.
So why has the Higgs government refused to come to the negotiation table with the First Nations?
Well, it's not, and I'm going to tell you flat out the way it works with government. Government comes up with an idea. They come up with laws and legal terms, and then they present it to the First Nations. Instead of before you go behind closed doors and come up with all these legislation and laws that you want to us to agree upon, why can't we be in the room from the very beginning? We know what's best that works for us. We know how our communities are run. And if you're going to do that behind closed doors and then give it to us to say yes or no to and tweak, it's a waste of time. We should be behind closed doors with them prior to anything else, prior to them coming to say, here, this is what we think you need. It would be a lot better if we were with them from the very beginning, from the concept of the idea itself. Let's sit together and not have all your bureaucrats sitting behind closed doors coming up with something that they think is best for us.
Right. In your press release, your organization has termed the Higgs government's indifference to the tax agreement as an economic genocide. Could you elaborate on this?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, of all the 15 First Nations across New Brunswick, we have a huge tax that's coming back to our communities, and we've been using those taxes to subsidize the programs that exist in our communities. But the genocide here is where he's going to take that money and tell us how to spend it, what he thinks is best for us. That's just not going to work. You got First Nations that are doing well, some are not, some are, and those that are doing well will be penalized. Those are the ones that are actually doing a lot of the work and you know, filling up that pot of money that the government will decide where it goes. And I do believe that First Nations want to be able to help all the other First Nations. So that's not the problem. We can work on that if that's the case. But for him to tell us who gets the funding and who doesn't, or the pot of tax money that actually is really First Nations collecting that. I believe also the way it works in, let's say, any city, your tax that your city sends to the government, there's a percentage given back to the city. Why can't they do that for the First Nations? You know, the more tax that your city makes, the bigger the money, the pot of money that you get on an annual basis is based on that tax that you've collected. But for some reason, it's not good for us. He wants to tell us how and where that money is going to be spent. And this just doesn't work wouldn't work for the city. It wouldn't work for the city of Moncton. Let's say Moncton's has all these taxes, and then we tell Moncton, oh, well, some of the money that you have, we're going to ship it to Edmundston. We're going to let Edmundston have some of that money because you have too much. That would never fly. So I'm not understanding his logic behind just taking that pot and then distributing it according to what he feels best, when we know what's best for us. And our chiefs in the communities have worked so hard to get where they are today, and to have that ripped out from underneath us. And at the end of the day, I've always said these 5-10-year agreements are ridiculous. You can't build an economy on a 5-year agreement. These agreements need to be long-term if we ever get back to that table. And I believe we will, maybe not with this government. It's almost patiently waiting right now. I believe that is how I feel. That's only my opinion, that we have to wait to the change of government and get a government in there that can see eye to eye with us and what's best for the communities in New Brunswick.
So is the tax agreement dividing the First Nations as collective especially on the issue of revenue sharing, or is the current tax agreement not enough, to sustain First Nations businesses or to collect the revenue?
No, there is no arguments among the First Nations. They're all doing their own thing, and they feel that they should be getting the funding that the tax their tax agreements accordingly. So, I feel that most First Nations here in New Brunswick have been doing what they're supposed to do to keep those tax agreements. We haven't gone outside of those agreements in any way, shape, or form. There are First Nations out there that are doing their own tobacco, their own cannabis, their own gaming. We haven't done that here in New Brunswick. We followed the rules, and this is what we get.
Right. Mhm.
It pulled out from underneath our feet like that. It's just not right.
So what are the demands of the First Nations on this tax agreement?
Well, to come to the table. And like I said, they do this all the time. They're behind closed doors now, probably coming up with an idea on what's best for us, and then they're going to present it to us. That can't work. It doesn't work that way. With anything, you need to be there from the initial idea to sit with the government and come up with something that will work for both of you, and not waste time by going behind closed doors, come back a year later and say, this is what we come up with, we'll offer you this. And then we have to negotiate that. Where if you start from the beginning, we would be saving a lot of time.
Mm-hmm. So Chief Joanna, what's the solution way ahead? If you can list out maybe in few points so that the government can come on board and fix this agreement.
Well, I don't know how it's going to happen, but I'm hoping that he understands how bad it is and what he's doing, and how bad it's going to be for the province if he doesn't come to the table. Not a threat in any way, shape, or form, but basically, once the First Nations get to a certain point, there's no return. They will get to that point of no return. If they're going to be working to do their own thing, once they get to that point and the government turns around and says, oh, well, now I'm ready to work with you, it may be too late. And I really would not like, I don't think that's the best for Canada, for New Brunswick, or the First Nations. So I'm just hoping that he wakes up now, do something now, because it's going to be too late after. I really feel that way. And again, my opinion only.
Thank you so much, Chief Joanna, for giving us your valuable time on this topic.
Thank you. Well, Alan.
And that was Chief Joanna joining us today from Truro, Nova Scotia. She talked with us about the tax agreement between the First Nations and the Higgs government. She has called on the Higgs government to renew the expiring tax agreement and also come to the table to speak with the First Nations and resolve the issue. For the NB Media Co-op, this is Arun Budathoki.